everyone! Boy, do I have some good news for you. Though I am fully aware that I've made videos like this before when we have had previous Prime Ministers stepping into number 10. When it comes to the newly elected leader of the Conservative Party and now Prime Minister, Liz Truss, I'm a bit more white-pilled and I want you to hear me out. Firstly, just a quick look at her cabinet. There are some special areas of interest that we should be quite white-pilled about. Firstly, there is Theresa Coffey as the Deputy Prime Minister and also the Health Secretary. There's currently a flattering picture of her holding a glass of Prosecco and a cigar to her mouth, as people are trying to point out that how can she be a Health Secretary when she looks like this and clearly has bad habits. And in reply, as a classical liberal who thinks people should be able to keep up these bad habits as long as they want, I think it's good that we have got a Catholic in the position who will probably be pushing for NHS reforms and will focus on the NHS side of things and fixing that, rather than trying to ban things that are bad for people, like the quote-unquote libertarian Boris Johnson was trying to do. So next up, the Chancellor is Kwasi Kwarteng, a rather smart man with a massive history in finance and business, going to Cambridge and writing positively about the history of the empire. So far, so good, I'd say. Next up, James Cleverly is the Foreign Secretary. He's an ex-Education Secretary and has, in fact, been a Foreign Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, so has some experience there, which will be good for the Foreign Office. Next up, and I'd probably say my favourite pick of the new cabinet, is Suella Braverman, who is the Home Secretary. She seems to fundamentally be for the same things that Priti Patel said that she was for, so controlling borders, reducing illegal immigration, improving the police force, things like that. But the thing is, Suella has a massive edge on Priti Patel in that she is a QC and has a background in law. So she will hopefully be able to target the specific laws that are being abused, that's stopping us from stopping illegal immigrants coming over, disincentivising them from coming over, and will help us also reduce immigration along with, say, getting rid of the College of Policing and getting rid of other laws that are completely pointless and putting people in jail and fining them for absolutely no reason whatsoever. I'm of course thinking of the Malcolms Acts there. Next on the list I've got is Ben Wallace. He's staying as Defence Secretary. This is fine because he's an ex-soldier, nothing much more to say about that. Finally, the last two interesting picks in the cabinet for me are Jacob Rees-Mogg, staying in the cabinet but moving to a more applicable role for him, which is as Business Secretary. The reason I like this is because Jacob Rees-Mogg was on the Leave side of the campaign and quite a vocal person about it. But one of his main reasons for wanting to get out of the European Union was to cut up all the red tape and start deregulating so that businesses can run more efficiently, which is something I've been begging the government to do for some years now. So it's good to finally see someone as Business Secretary who is on board with that. And the final pick of the cabinet I will go through is Kemi Badenoch, who was my favourite to be the next Prime Minister, or I should say Tory leader, but unfortunately was knocked out in one of the early rounds. However, she is getting experience in the cabinet now, which is an excellent thing to see, as the International Trade Secretary. A lot of people wanted to see her as Culture or Education Secretary because she is vehemently on the anti-woke side of things and quite vocal about it. Given she's in the cabinet at all, that shows me that Liz Truss is on that side of things as well, and probably has more experienced people in the roles for Education and Culture Secretary. However, Kemi Badenoch's background is in banking and software, though specifically the banking part will be very useful for the International Trade Minister that she is currently in the position of. And, you know, I'd like her to be Education or Culture Secretary as well, but we've got to look at this from the point of view of Liz Truss. Culture Secretary is in the lower end of the cabinet. They basically look and see what Channel 4 and the BBC and other publicly funded arts and literature and museums are doing and make government policy for that. That's fine, okay, but I think Liz Truss wants to put her skills in a more applicable place, which is on the International Trade Secretary. And when it comes to the Education Secretary, that's quite a high up one. You know, you make policy for the national curriculum there. It's quite a big job. And putting someone inexperienced in a cabinet role in Education Secretary is quite a risk, I think. So I think this is the best place for her at the moment. I think it's a good decision from Liz Truss to put her there. And there's always a chance for a reshuffle in a few years. And when she's got more experience, you never know, you might see her somewhere up there in Education Secretary or maybe even higher as the Home Secretary. Who knows? So from the looks of this cabinet, it looks to be rather more minarchist than previous cabinets we have seen. It seems to genuinely be a move away from the Blairitism we've been seeing, even surprisingly with Boris Johnson. However, of course, this is the British government. I'm not expecting any miracles. I am just hoping for slowly moving away from the status quo we have now. It's going to be difficult to expect a Margaret Thatcher type revolution here when it comes to the economy, given that we are not moving from a disaster of a Tory under Ted Heath to Labour, who exacerbated all the problems caused by Ted Heath, to go to Margaret Thatcher, who was a person for radical change. Liz Truss doesn't seem that radical when it comes to it, though she is trying to LARP as Margaret Thatcher, so she may surprise us, she may take massive risks. But you may be wondering at this point, what exactly are her plans? Well, luckily, The Guardian has a whole article about that. What policies will Liz Truss pursue as Britain's new Prime Minister? Truss sets out a series of proposals during the Tory leadership contest, but what can and will she deliver in office? For taxation and cost of living, Truss's clear economic priority is to cut taxes. That is a big win. A move she insists will reboot a stalled economy and help people with soaring energy bills. She has promised to reverse the recent increase in national insurance and to cancel a scheduled rise in corporation tax, at a combined cost of about £30 billion a year. The way The Guardian writes it, that is specifically a cost to the government, but that also means that will probably be a saving to corporations and people who play in national insurance of about £30 billion a year. Truss's team have also mooted the idea of slashing VAT by 5% or cutting income tax to help household budgets. Well, national insurance is just another form of income tax, so she is technically doing that anyway. While Truss has said that her plans will be paid for by fiscal headroom and delayed the repayment of COVID-related debts, critics have argued that she will need to borrow considerable sums at potentially expensive rates at some cost to the economy. One option could be to expand a windfall tax on energy firms, but Truss has said she dislikes this, because all it is a predatory way for the government to take profits off companies who have earned them. There is also a considerable scepticism about a tax cut-based response to the energy cost crisis, which would disproportionately benefit high earners and do nothing for those reliant on pensions or benefits. Truss has not ruled out more direct help over energy bills, but has refused to say explicitly what this might be, and has talked about a distaste for handouts. It is a position that is about to be tested against economic reality. If I were to guess how she would help out with lower income earners, it wouldn't be a direct handout. She'd probably utilise the price cap to some degree. She'd obviously have to raise it, but maybe not raise it as much, and then probably have to subsidise the energy companies. It's a good short-term solution because, honestly, energy prices are going insane in the UK. Apart from that, she'll probably look longer term and have more production of fossil fuels be done in the UK, along with production of more renewable and nuclear power plant sites to be created. Given at this point they are actually much cheaper than these other power sources, the issue is, of course, when they are not running they do rely on fossil fuels, but hey, that's where nuclear comes in. For climate change and green energy, while Truss has stressed her commitment to the UK's existing net zero targets, because if she didn't she'd be hounded out of Parliament, and her team insists she will focus on renewable energy, some on the greener side of the Conservative Party are becoming worried about her priorities. Why don't they just move to the Lib Dems then? One of Truss's few direct policies on the cost of living would be to suspend green levies on energy bills, which are used to invest in renewable schemes, at the cost of energy bills. She opposed onshore wind and described seeing solar farms on farmland as one of the most depressing sights of modern Britain. This is coming from me. I actually... Onshore wind and solar farms are actually quite popular, and when they say it's on farmland, usually it's on disused farmland. So if someone wants to sell their farmland they're not using and give it to the solar farm company, I actually don't have too much issue with that. In contrast, she supports fracking for shale gas and reportedly wants to see a push for new drilling in the North Sea, and has backed major expansion of nuclear power. Win, 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 win. She has not talked about efforts to reduce energy consumption, such as subsidising insulation for homes. Well, that's because most homes in the UK are insulated anyway. But that is one of the most impressive things I've seen from a Prime Minister recently. That looks like the type of thing where she says she is for net zero by 2050, just because it's an old promise made, but really from the looks of that she's not really looking to get to net zero by 2050, which as far as I'm concerned is absolutely fine. Next up we have health and social care. Truss has received relatively little scrutiny over her plans for the NHS and care. That's probably because people are looking to survive the cold this winter with their heating, especially given that the crisis in the health service and the widespread expectation things will get much worse into winter. While she remains committed to existing plans to support the NHS, there is the issue that Truss has promised to reverse the national insurance rise aimed at providing cash firstly to help clear the COVID exacerbation backlog of NHS procedures, and in the longer term to pay for better social care. Much of the problems with delayed ambulances are because hospital beds are filled with people unable to access social care. Truss will need a coherent plan, and soon. Well, if Theresa Coffey is involved, maybe it's Prosecco and cigars for all. But for those who don't know, the NHS is said to have a backlog of at least 6 million people, and there's also the possibility of a hidden backlog of about 10 million people, meaning that at a minimum, if these things are true, there are 16 million people waiting for follow-ups from GPs, waiting for surgeries, waiting for cancer treatment, for God's sake. The NHS can't cope with that because they had to push it out the way for all the COVID patients, despite the fact that Nightingale hospitals were built and never seemed to be used. It's all very confusing. But anyway, next up we will look at immigration and home affairs. During the campaign, Truss has promised to double down on the policy of deporting asylum seekers and other immigrants to Rwanda, very based, and seek other countries who will take them. It remains to be seen how feasible this is, or if it would have any impact on the number of people crossing the channel by unofficial means, even if some did depart. Truss is likely to link any failure to remove people to the continued jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. While removing the UK entirely from its oversight would be complex and tricky, she is likely to push ahead with plans for a so-called UK Bill of Rights with fewer protections for asylum seekers and others. Well, given the law at the moment forces us to keep them for an indefinite amount of time, something probably should be done about that because we're running out of room to put them. So much so that they are now probably better treated than most people who are on universal credit or even the homeless. And not only that, but it appears that around half the people crossing the channel illegally turn out to be Albanians. And now we have massive Albanian gangs set up in the southeast. Somehow I think they're connected. But next up we have culture wars. Truss is more of a keen amateur culture warrior than a die-hard aficionado, keeping the Tory faithful happy at hustling events with passing swipes at woke culture and trans rights. I need an example of how she's taking swipes at trans rights, but okay. However, if, as tipped, she appoints Suella Braverman as Home Secretary and Kemi Badenoch to Education, the temperature could rise considerably. Well, she did one of them, and Badenoch's in the cabinet. You never know. Give it a few years, she might get a promotion. Culture war issues tend to be more focused on seeking debate and political dividing lines than actual policies, but particularly in education it could lead to changes in approach, for example, on trans rights and free speech. Oh, cry me a river, Guardian. The Guardian are actually ridiculous for saying this because the reason they're going on about trans rights is because they have to double down. People have left the Guardian because they felt, well, basically they were TERFs and they felt that they were taking the side too much with trans radical activists. And given how many garbage opinion pieces I've seen about trans rights being the most fundamental thing in the West from The Guardian, I can't imagine why they would leave. But this is The Guardian double downing on that. When it comes to culture wars, barely any of it's got to do with trans rights. That's something that The Guardian think is a big issue, but that's only a big issue for feminists and trans activists, most of which the UK doesn't care about. What woke culture and what culture wars are really about is basically a nationalist push against globalism. It's about defending the myths, culture and history of the United Kingdom instead of having it all censored or having it quote-unquote recontextualised to say that everyone in the British history was actually a horrible person and probably worse than Hitler. And The Guardian saying, oh, it might affect free speech. Yeah, hopefully in a positive way, and in fact more than likely in a positive way. Because The Guardian are trying to imply with this article here that what's going to happen is trans radical activists will have their speech suppressed by this new culture warrior cabinet and Prime Minister, when in reality they are just going to protect the speech of people like the poor guy down south at a school for being the college chaplain. He basically said in one of his sermons that you don't have to completely follow the LGBT indoctrination. It's not all true. You can critically think about these things. And then the school, the diocese, the bishops, they all went against him and got him kicked out of that job. So yeah, I imagine that the side that is having their speech suppressed by the culture warriors from that side are probably going to try and protect that speech. rather than suppress yours. But of course, if The Guardian admits that they're on top, they won't sell as many papers to the BBC. But that's pretty much everything I can say of her plans for now. I'm at the higher end of my optimism for politics, which these days is cautiously optimistic. Inevitably, mistakes will be made, but when it comes to Liz Truss and the way that she's gone about with her leadership campaign, she was clearly my favourite choice over Rishi Sunak, who was trying to play innocent when it came to things like lockdown and the economy, despite the fact that he was completely overlooking the economy throughout the last government. But when it comes to Liz Truss, she has a lot of new, fresh faces, and a lot of people who, over the years who I have been following, seem to have been quite based in the particular positions that they are in, especially when it comes to Jacob Rees-Mogg and Suella Braverman, because it is worth bearing in mind, Suella Braverman is one of the key reasons that we got a Brexit harder than the one Theresa May was going to put through. She was going through the courts to say, no, this isn't Brexit, it's got to be harder. And of course, my old favourite, Steve Baker's in the cabinet as Northern Ireland Secretary. Again, I think like Kemi Badenoch, he's going into a more junior cabinet role, and hopefully in the future will get the experience to move up the greasy pole to maybe one day become Chancellor or Education Secretary or maybe even PM. He's a good Christian man and has a healthy scepticism of democracy, we'll say. So it'll be interesting to see if he ever gets anywhere higher up in the Tory party, but I sincerely hope he does. He seems like a good MP. And when it comes to the backbenchers, well, it appears that the backbenchers are turning into the more wet Tories and the front benches are more turning into the dry Tories. A bit like how it turned out when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. So, again, cautiously optimistic. But we can only wait and see. I can imagine quite a few videos are going to be made by me about this particular premiership. But in the meantime, that's all I have for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.